All right. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're excited to talk about Sensational, the Hidden History of America's Girl Stunt Reporters with author Kim Todd. If you have questions, please post them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the program. So I'm going to start by introducing our presenter today. Kim Todd is an award-winning author and teaches on the MFA faculty at the University of Minnesota. Her previous books include Tinkering with Eden, A Natural History of Exotic Species in American and Chrysalis, Maria Sibylla Marion, and The Secrets of Metamorphosis. I so should have asked you how to say that. And her essays and articles have appeared in Smithsonian, Salon, Sierra Magazine, and Orion. She is a senior fellow with the Environmental Leadership Program and lives in Minneapolis with her family. So welcome. Would you like to start by telling us a little bit about the book and reading a passage?
Yes, I would love to. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so pleased to be here. So I think I'll start with the passage, and then I think that'll lead into an explanation of the book. So in the section that I'm going to read, it's the fall of 1887. And there's a young reporter named Elizabeth Cochran who writes under the pseudonym Nellie Bly. And she's moved to New York to try to find a job at the big glamorous newspapers there. And she isn't having any luck after months and months of trying. So in a stroke of inspiration, she assigns herself an article about women in journalism and goes to interview all the major editors. And this gets her past the front desk. But the interviews are very discouraging, and the editors just think that all women are good for is writing about, ball gowns and society gossip. And, they can't be sent anywhere that might be, dangerous. So here she is kind of mulling over what she's learned after this series of interviews. Nonetheless, these encounters provided food for thought. Though her interview subjects talked about education, experience, and writing ability, the front pages they published displayed a journalism that valued sheer nerve. The editor's view of what a woman could do was narrow, framed by convention. But what if she could enlarge it? The editor of the Telegram had said, "Women understand women as men never can, so why should she not be able to write of their ways and habits?" He meant that they grasped intricacies of weddings and waltzes, but wasn't this true in other ways as well? Plenty of women crowded courts and jails. They just weren't reporters. Cockrell, the editor of The World, had claimed no editor would like to send a woman out in bad weather or to questionable places for news. But what if the story was irresistible, right in the middle of police stations and holding cells and other unseemly places? And what if it was something only a woman could do? By September, Bly's purse had been stolen. Her rent was overdue. Pride wouldn't let her return to Pittsburgh and admit failure, so she put on her lucky ring, a gold band around her thumb, and returned to Newspaper Row and the dirty, dilapidated building that housed The World. Somehow she talked her way past the elevator operator up to the editorial department, saying she had an important story, and if the editor didn't want to hear it, she'd take it elsewhere. Face to face with editor Cockrell again, she said he could send her out in bad weather, but she had no objection to questionable places, that she wasn't going to quit and get married. She told him her ideas, including traveling in steerage from Europe and writing about the immigrant experience. He gave her $25 to keep her from going to another paper while he thought it over. Bly must have appeared sufficiently bold or sufficiently reckless. When she returned, Cockrell asked whether she thought she could fake her way into New York's notorious insane asylum for women on Blackwell's Island, past the doctors, keeping up her role without discovery to report on conditions there. It was an opening and Bly took it. "I don't know what I can do until I try." "Well, you can try," Cockrell said, "but if you can do it, it's more than anyone would believe." So she does. She spends 10 days in the asylum successfully. And the stories that she writes for The World when she comes out are a sensation. And they sell so many copies that they cause editors all over the country to think they would like to hire reporters to do that kind of work. And they cause young women all over the country to think that that seems like the kind of exciting work that they would like to do. So this launches a decade of innovative journalism by these writers who would be called girl stunt reporters. And that's the subject of the book.
All right, so I want to start with some background on newspaper publishing during the time frame of your book. Some things feel very similar as today, the pressure to be first and scoop other publications, but other things are much different. Can you talk a bit about publishing and the newspaper wars that were happening?
Yes. So one of the major things that happened to shake up 19th century journalism was that Joseph Pulitzer arrived in New York in 1883 and bought the New York World. And at the time, papers were relatively expensive and they often served corporate interests or political interests. And the writing was really targeted at the highly educated. And I'm actually going to read his description of his vision of journalism because I think it's so good. He said that he wanted to create a newspaper that he thought of as truly democratic. And here he's writing, dedicated to the cause of the people rather than purse potentates, devoted more to the news of the new rather than the old world, one that will expose all fraud and sham, fight all public evils and abuses, that will serve and battle for people with earnest sincerity. And he wanted to attract a new audience, immigrants, laborers, women particularly, and it was really successful. So much so that a young man who had flunked out of Harvard, William Randolph Hearst, went to work for Pulitzer's paper for a while, and then he took those techniques that he'd learned there and brought them to the San Francisco Examiner. And then ultimately he bought a paper, the Journal, in New York, came back to the city to compete with Pulitzer on his own terms and his own turf. And this created a vicious battle for circulation numbers in the 1890s as they each tried to sell more newspapers any given day. And both of the papers hired these women who wrote just the kind of popular stories that sold really well and made the papers, fly off the shelves. They appealed to diverse audiences. They told a story that kept the reader wanting to find out what would happen next. A lot of them kind of read like serialized novels, so you would show up and get the paper the next day. And they often also had the reporter as a first person narrator, kind of, leading you and immersing you into the stories. So it was a really exciting model. And they also were competing in terms of price. So the papers got cheaper and cheaper to sell more and more. So
I think that it's kind of interesting that I had recently listened to a podcast called You're Wrong About. And apparently one of them is this huge Newsies fan. And so they did like a whole 2 episodes on how Disney did this movie, but really it's about true things that were happening. And so kind of as I was reading your book, I was thinking about that kind of musical and the fight between more extras, more larger headlines, the prices, and kind of this whole who can scoop who first. And it creates an interesting world in which do you care more about being first, or do you care more about truthfully portraying something, right? And so it's just kind of that peak of that, what's more important, the truth or being first, which is still something today that is this battle between different presses about what they're going to portray. But it's also interesting to me that at this period of time, stories were serialized, right? So you didn't expect to know everything with that one article. And so was that really just a battle to sell more papers, or did they just think that people wouldn't read the newspaper if you didn't have, like to be continued type information?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, to go to your earlier point, like certainly the quicker you are, like even if what you have is accurate, like it's definitely not going to be the big picture, right? It's definitely not going to be in context as much as it would be, if you waited a little longer. So I think that's always a kind of a trade-off. I don't know that they were serialized in terms of they had the whole story and they decided we're going to run this chunk on Monday and this chunk on Tuesday. A lot of it was happening in real time, right? And we're used to that. Like, if you think of someone like scrolling a Twitter feed, right? It's like, oh, well, like what's happening now? Like what's happening now? And you go further and further. And so, I don't know, I think of like William Randolph Hearst doing, like he had his reporters acting as detectives and trying to like find murderers. And so he would like, last night at 2 a.m., they discovered this clue, and he would show like a picture of it in the newspaper, and then, would provide the most up-to-date information the next day.
That was one of the stories that I thought was so fascinating, that that he had them out there like solving crime. I don't know what that says about the state of the crime solving for, police or whatever at the time. But I just think it's really interesting that one of the first things they did was kind of crowdsource finding and solving murders or crimes, which is interestingly today what people use the internet to do.
Yeah, and they were always, it was interesting that an example, like they're always using like the best technology and pushing the technology to better tell the story, right? Like so when they found this piece of cloth around like a chunk of a body, like they ran some kind of color image of it, if like the color that would have been available at the time. And part of what people didn't like about the journalism, but which I really like, is that they got like bigger and bigger and more complex illustrations. So the newspapers themselves are actually quite beautiful to look at sometimes.
It's so fascinating. So let's talk about the women. Okay. And the stunts they were doing in the beginning, and then how those stunts evolved over time. So you've got Nellie Bly getting locked up in the asylum, which for me personally, I cannot imagine doing that. I mean, what was, when you think about what's your plan for how you're going to get out and right, and how are you going to contact people? And yeah, I mean, it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah. And the real hardships of trying to do a job, like she talks about, well, they took away my notebook and pencil, and then I was doing something they didn't like, so they drugged me, like when you think about like trying to get the story under all these conditions. Anyway, right after Nellie Bly, you had people doing journalism very similar to her work because it had been so successful. So today it would be called immersion journalism or investigative journalism or solutions journalism, which is like, reporting designed to help solve a particular societal problem. So these women would go often into disguise, into places where only women would have access, and they reported on what they found there. So, for example, Helen Cusack, who used the alias Nell Nelson, got herself hired at various Chicago factories, and she wrote about the dirty and really perilous conditions that she found there: child labor, sexual harassment. Another reporter, Winifred Sweet, who worked for Hearst's paper in San Francisco, she pretended to faint in downtown San Francisco and then was picked up and taken to the public hospital. And she wrote about the really terrible treatment that poor women received there, particularly at the hands of one sadistic doctor. But as the genre developed in the mid 1890s, so the stunts also often became more about women going into dangerous situations, like climbing the Harlem River Bridge or driving a freight train very fast or descending to the bottom of Boston Harbor in a diving suit. And as I mentioned, the illustrations were getting bigger and bigger. And so often like these articles included a picture of these women doing the dangerous activity. So many people who really like the early investigative work kind of find these stunts like silly or frivolous in comparison. But I actually think that they have their own kind of value. A lot of women were really expected to stay at home because exertion was deemed too taxing for their frail bodies. And here with these papers like showing the female body like being brave and having adventures. And I think they also were important because they were precursors of comic book heroines, also highly illustrated, obviously, like Lois Lane and Brenda Starr. And if I could show the cover of the book, which I really love, I feel like it captures that very well, like kind of like, oh, it's like both a silhouette of an actual woman, but kind of looking forward to this kind of comic book presentation, which I think they really started.
So several of these stunts affect public policy. So you've got Nellie Bly, her stories, affect what's going on in that asylum. You have all these women sneaking into factories, and then you have the labor movement kind of starting from this. And I know there was a section right before that there was this whole strike going on, and kind of they were speaking to women, and there were women's voices that were part of that labor movement. So kind of talk about the things that they were able to change, which when we think about women in this time frame, we don't think that they have a lot of abilities to change things, right? This is in some cases pre having the right to vote. And they didn't always get along with the suffragettes either, which I think is also very fascinating.
So a number of the stunts had an effect on public policy. Bly, as you mentioned, right after her story, the board in charge of the asylum appropriated all this additional money for it, and her work got more female doctors hired at the asylum. So Nell Nelson, who I mentioned before, her work in the factories inspired the formation of the Illinois Women's Alliance, which advocated and helped pass a law protecting factory workers and child laborers. And she also, later on in her life, worked to get more female factory inspectors when she had moved to New York. And sometimes, as you pointed out, they became really moved from journalism to activism and made the change themselves. So you mentioned the strike. There was a reporter in Minneapolis, Eva McDonald, who became a labor leader, and her first story, inspired a strike at the Shotwell textile factory that she was writing about. And she had been friends with some of the women there. And then there was also Victoria Earle Matthews, who reported on exploitative employment agencies that preyed on Black women from the South who were moving to New York. And these employment agencies would offer to pay their ship fare and help them find jobs when they got there. And then when they arrived, they found themselves just trapped in this cycle of debt that they could never get out of, and really having hardly any freedom at all, and an inability to get the kind of jobs that they wanted. So Matthews also became an activist. She turned away from journalism, and she started a settlement house in New York to give these women a place to live and socialize and develop job skills, rather than being at the mercy of these employment agencies and not really knowing anyone in this new city. So all kinds of changes they've prompted.
Well, and two, I mean, obviously this is long before there's ever a discussion about feminism. but these are women who are definitely like, they're out there proving that they can do anything the men can do. They can, they can bring in the business, right? Their stories are selling more papers, and they're really pushing the boundaries of what we think of as, at the time, what women could do.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me as I was writing it, like as you pointed out, they couldn't vote. They were like decades from being able to get the vote. But this kind of job gave them the ability in some instances to like interview the president. Like Eva McDonald interviewed the president, right? That's a lot of power for somebody who couldn't vote. So.
Yeah, and we think of when we're voting that we are having an effect on public policy, and here are these women, because of the stories that they're they're changing the way people who live around them think about kids in factories and those sorts of things. Something that probably it's certainly not something that a man probably would have written about to begin with, and yet it has this overreaching kind of consequence for even how we think of things today. Because today we would think, who puts a child to work, right? But that was not the case. That was not the case then.
Yeah, and as you point out, like we think about, people getting their voices heard in terms of public policy by being able to vote. And so women didn't have that avenue. So one of the things that these writers were doing were really like highlighting the need and making the case for some of these policy changes.
So of course, as they've made all these strides, then there comes the turn, right? So let's talk about how the Spanish-American War brought the end of stunt reporters and what emerged after that. And we probably need to talk about what the Spanish-American War was, for anybody in the audience who, I know we probably didn't cover that. We probably didn't get that far in history when I was in high school history. So I figure we should probably talk about what it is first, before we talk about then how that kind of changed what reporting was.
Well, the very, very brief version is sort of during the 1890s, Spain controlled Cuba, and many Cubans were rebelling against this, wanting to control their country themselves. And both Hearst, Journer, and Pulitzer of the World were advocating for the US to join the war on the part of the Cubans. They were writing very sympathetic stories about the plight of the Cubans. When the US finally did join the war in April of 1898, all of a sudden, the main topic on the front pages of all the papers was war. And assigning women to be war correspondents was too much for the editors, who not long before had seen no problem with sending them into dangerous factories and insane asylums. One editor describes, female reporters like basically pleading to go and declaring that they were like the one person who was brave enough to enter Havana in disguise and return with all of the information that can be gleaned that way, but they really weren't allowed. And one woman named Kathleen Coleman, who did get a press pass to cover the war, couldn't find a boat willing to take her from Florida to Cuba until the war was basically over. And so her reporting was basically the aftermath. So during the war, they didn't have the opportunity to do much writing, and many were like directly fired. Eva McDonald was fired from the journal where she was working at the time, or they kind of saw the writing on the wall and turned to other forms of work. Elizabeth Jordan became a magazine editor. I haven't mentioned her before, but she was another reporter at the World. And also, like after the war, people felt kind of queasy about the turn that journalism had taken during the war. As you mentioned, a lot of the stories were, the war was part of the circulation battle. A lot of the stories in the effort to get there first were exaggerated or turned out to be completely untrue. The term yellow journalism had been used before this, but it really became very associated with the kind of reporting that happened around the war. And the newspapers themselves, journalists themselves, editors themselves, saw that they really wanted to distance themselves from that kind of reporting. The profession began to professionalize, developing codes of ethics that were taught in the journalism schools, which started to spring up. And unfortunately for the stunt reporters, their work was so associated with those papers, the papers of Hearst and Pulitzer, who had hired lots and lots of them, that public opinion turned against them as well. And they ended up being kind of like tossed in the dustbin and written out of history.
And I think it's interesting that after the war, right, there was a lot of conversation around this yellow journalism and around did the papers push us into being in this war? Did we join the war because someone in order to sell and make money, did they push us to do this, and maybe we shouldn't have been involved in that?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the interesting things about researching the book, is that it seemed to me that yellow journalism was really like the cry of the competitors of Hearst and Pulitzer, the not entirely successful competitors at that given time. So some of the criticisms were valid, like certainly there was like some very poor stories that were written and definitely some fabrications that were printed. On the other hand, like a lot of their objections, in the light of 2021, like just don't seem to make any sense or aren't concerning. They're like, but the headlines are so big. And it's like, well, that's okay if the headlines are big, not really an issue.
It's a text choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me that aesthetics is part of this conversation, right? Because, I mean, we even know today that newspapers write for kind of a lower reading level than we would expect that they do, because they're trying to reach a much broader swath of people. So, the pictures and the typeface, some of that, we are talking about a period of time when not everyone read or read well, right? Not everyone, schools were not as formalized in some cases, and there wasn't a public policy that your children had to go to school, right? Because they were in the factories working. So it's interesting to me that some of the complaints from competitors were about the aesthetics of the look of the paper and not the content of the paper.
Yeah, agreed. And those are the complaints that don't really hold up over time so much.
And so even though they're mostly forgotten, I think they've definitely left a legacy, right? They've kind of started this whole activism type journalism, investigative journalism. Can you talk about the legacy that we see today?
Yeah, that was really one of the purposes in writing the book. I wanted to tell these stories, but then I really wanted to make the argument that a lot of the work that these women did, just you see it all over the literary landscape in all kinds of different forms. So it's obviously there in investigative reporting where reporters go undercover. So if you look at what Shane Bauer did working as a prison guard, or Barbara Ehrenreich did trying to live on minimum wage for her book Nickel and Dimed. There was actually one of these reporters, in the 1890s, her whole article was like, can I live on $3 a week? And that was, an average factory worker's salary. So very much you hear that echo, 100 years later. I see it in the ongoing effort to cover overlooked communities and document corporate abuses. And I also see it separate from journalism in the field of what we talk about as creative nonfiction, which uses a lot of times, a engaging first person narrator to tell a true story, and uses, and structures memoirs and essays like novels with scenes and a lot of dialogue. And those were things that the stunt reporters really did, which made their writing so engaging and made people want to pick up the issues where it was.
Well, and didn't at least one of them actually like write a biography as well? I mean,
oh, like wrote a memoir about herself.
Right.
Oh yeah,
Right.
I mean, a number of them did. The one that comes immediately, well, yeah, a number of them did, now that I think about it. So Elizabeth Jordan wrote one. I mentioned her briefly. She was a reporter and then editor at The World, and then went to work at Harper's Bazaar as an editor. And then also this reporter, who I haven't mentioned, named Elizabeth Banks, wrote 3 memoirs, actually one after the other. And it was interesting, in each one she was like, well, last time I wasn't really able to tell you the truth, but now I'm going to tell you the facts about what went on. So they're very fun to read. She's a good writer.
I mean, it's just so fascinating how we don't know. I mean, like, people know who, like, I knew the name Nellie Bly, but I probably didn't know like much more than that. And Ida B. Wells, like, I knew who that was as well. But for the most part, the rest of them, right, they're lost to history. And it's very interesting how they kind of created kind of some whole genres of what we would consider journalism and nonfiction writing that weren't really happening before. And yet we don't know that this is the legacy that they've left to us.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to highlight the individual women, of course, because I don't want them to be lost to history, because I think they're amazing. But also, like, I thought of myself as writing a biography of this lost genre. You know what I mean? There was like 10 years where all of this amazing work was happening, and people just don't have a sense, of it. Like, they may have heard of Bly and they're like, oh, here's this one exceptional woman, but they don't have a sense of like her really launching this entire field.
Yeah, I mean, I loved this book. So it was just so engaging, and just the interesting stories about the things that they did. So let's talk about your research process, and how do you go from the research to words on page?
Yeah. I love research, so I do have to force myself to turn from it and to like now put some words on the page. But my books usually start with a question. And this book started with 2. So one, just as we were talking about, I was wondering, like, why didn't I, like a woman writer who's very interested in like both nonfiction and women writers, know about these, girl stunt reporters? Why had I never heard of them? So that was one question. And then the second one was, who was the woman who wrote this abortion expose for the Chicago Times in 1888? And she's only referred to in the newspaper. She doesn't even get a full pseudonym, as the girl reporter. And no one claimed credit for that work, which had made this national impact. So those questions really structure the research. And so in this case, I looked at letters, I looked at photographs, I looked at court cases. I was hoping that the girl reporter would be named in one of the cases where doctors sued the Chicago Times for libel, scrapbooks, and you mentioned memoirs by women. So if they were available, I read memoirs, and so many newspaper articles, either by the women or about the women, or looking to create the scene of the time where they were living. I was really interested in how they thought of their work, and then if there were letters or any kind of journal, how they presented themselves on the page in published work, and then how they presented themselves more privately. I was very interested in that gap. And you can just learn so much from archival documents. There was this one reporter, Eleanor Stackhouse, and she wrote about young boys being held in the men's Cook County jail as one of her many stories. And a decade later, after she had left reporting, she still signed her name with her pseudonym, which was Nora Marks. And it was just like such evidence that, she took such pride in this work, even though, she'd only done it for maybe 2 years. So that's the kind of discovery which I really love to find.
And so then how do you take all of that information, right? You had your two storylines, and then how do you say, okay, I'm going to spend this much time on this person, this much time on this person, and then how am I going to weave those into each other?
Yeah, that is a good question. So the question kind of drives the initial research as I'm trying to figure out the answer to the question. And then pretty early on, I create an outline for the book. And this was the only, and usually I stick pretty closely to that outline. So it's like, what research do I need to do, for this chapter? This was the only book where I really changed the outline in the middle, which was very scary. Originally, it was more thematic. And then I just decided, like, it's a 10-year span of time. I'm going to go chronologically and kind of like weave these women back and forth and highlight the points, where they touch, like they all meet in the World Office, at a particular time, or they're all off covering a certain strike. And then, so later after that, once I have a draft, readers really help me figure out, what I need to fill in. And I do a lot of research as part of the editing process. When I was writing an earlier book about the artist and naturalist Maria Sybil Marion, my husband read a draft, and he was like, well, what was it like to be a girl in 1860s Germany? Like, what kind of tours would she do? And did she go to school? And, all those things which I didn't know. And that kind of gave me some research tasks for the next draft. Like, okay, I need to figure out schooling for girls in, 1650s Germany or whatever. So,
and kind of plug in the holes, right?
Yeah.
So are you working on anything new?
I am. So my roots are really as a science writer. So I'm going back to that. And I'm working on a project about the relationships between humans and predatory animals, particularly in the US. So the question that led me into this book was, well, if you look at the 20th century, we made a very deliberate effort to try to exterminate some of these animals and went pretty far down this path. But now we've realized that that's not the best idea, and we've stopped, and a lot of them are coming back. I don't know if you're following the stories about, coyotes in Chicago and bears wandering into different cities here and there. So I guess the question is, now that they're starting to come back, are we more prepared to live with them than we were before? Because people still seem pretty upset when a coyote shows up in their neighborhood. So so that's what I'm working on.
Yeah, that I love this topic. This topic is really interesting because one, I've been reading all the stuff about the wolves, around the Grand Canyon area, and that ranchers are very upset that they let the wolves come back. But also, having lived both here in Texas and in Southern California, I've lived in areas where like there are coyotes in my neighborhood. And so like the time of year when they're out, all the messages go around to, don't let your pets outside, and then obviously bobcats in walking, bobcats on trails in San Diego is a huge common sort of occurrence, right? That people are just really used to. So it's really fascinating me kind of how we thought we needed to live without them, but then ecosystem wise, we need them, right? And then how do you do that, right? Because like nobody wants the coyote to get their little dog at 5 a.m, which just happened in my neighborhood. So that's exciting.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to keep an eye out for that. So it doesn't look like we have any questions. So I'm going to ask you one more question. I think we're
Sure.
going to call it the evening. So is there anything you wanted to talk about that I didn't ask?
Oh, that's a really good question. Oh, well, so many things just rush to mind. Two things, if I can have two things.
Sure.
One is you mentioned Ida B. Wells, and I do cover her in the book. She definitely was not a stunt reporter. Like, the role of the stunt reporter was really a role that, you know, white women played for these white-owned newspapers, but she certainly pioneered investigative reporting in all of these different kind of ways. And it's just fascinating to me. So on the one hand, her journey into reporting is so different from a lot of these other women that I'm writing about. On the other hand, she's doing it exactly the same time. So it's interesting to me that all these women born during or just after the Civil War, there's something going on in the 1880s and 1890s, which is creating this opportunity for them to really make their voices heard about the issues that they care about on the page. And then the other thing that I was interested in writing the book was just kind of the notion of reputation, and, you know, where was that at risk? Where was it not at risk? You know, how did these women conceive of the work that they were doing? And I think that was one of the reasons I was so fascinated and tried to track down the girl reporter who'd written about abortion, because I wondered if that wasn't part of the reason that she never came forward to claim the stories. Like, a lot of these women were kind of dancing on the edge of respectability. Like, you know, maybe if you're in the finest society, you would not enter an asylum and, you know, let yourself be thrown in the bath with all these other women, this very dirty bath and all these kinds of things. But, you know, so I wondered, you know, was that a step too far? Was like going to a doctor and, you know, pretending to be pregnant out of wedlock and requesting an abortion, like, too much for a woman to do and then sort of recover and have a career after that. So that was one of the things I was interested in. And a lot of the women, I think, clearly felt conflicted about it themselves. Like, some of the women, when people began to condemn this stunt reporting, they also condemned it by the same token, they recognized that it was this like very useful career path that had given them a lot financially as well as otherwise. So.
Yeah, I love the story of your research about trying to figure out who that female reporter is, and you know, given that even today it's such a huge controversial topic, right? You know, it's interesting that while she was doing that, right, there are ads in the newspapers about kind of how to do it yourself sort of thing, and this whole tightrope back and forth between what someone is allowed to do and what someone isn't allowed to do, and then do you put your name on that, right? Whereas the information that she was gathering was important and, you know, informative, but also, you know, not willing or not able to put your name out there to say, hey, yeah, I did those things.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to me when you talked about researching the court papers and still not finding her as part of the libel suits. You know, it's really interesting, right? Yes. So the question then is, so did the doctors also were never able to figure out who she really was either? And that's why she's not listed. And interesting that it shows the newspaper protecting something that they do today, right? But protecting the reporter and protecting the sources. Yeah,
very much so. I mean, a lot of, you know, doctors came into the newspaper office to sort of explain themselves or say that they thought that the reporter had been lying. And the papers really defended her, all of them. You know, Winifred Sweet was attacked and Nellie Bly's credibility was attacked, and the editors really backed them up.
So, you know, I think that I just think that's interesting that that's one thing that we would write. We would absolutely recognize that in journalism today, right? The we're entitled to tell the story, and we don't have to give up our sources for that story, right? We have enough information to say this is the truth, and you know, we're willing to go to court over that. So, you know, and that also that they weren't throwing the women under the bus given the time period that they were in, right? They weren't like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Yeah, you're on your own, right? For whatever. Yeah.
It was a very, like, particularly during the newspaper wars, it was a very good time to be a reporter. Like, one of, you know, some of the ammunition that the publishers used was they just kept hiring star reporters back and forth at higher and higher salaries. So that we might not recognize from today, but it was a very good time to be in the newspaper business.
Well, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed our conversation today. Yeah. And I hope that this book inspires people to look into other hidden stories. We will post a recording of this program to our YouTube page in the next week or so. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more great content from the Fort Worth Public Library and turn on those notifications. If you would like to purchase a copy of the book, they are available at the Dock Bookshop here in Fort Worth, one of our local independents. And this is their contact information. And we hope you come back. We have lots of great author visits through the end of the year. And thank you so much, Kim. This was great. I really appreciate your time tonight.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.